All right, come on down. So I think we're ready to get started. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel moderator, Dormer Stephen from Shipman & Goodwin. Shipman & Goodwin is a really valued partner of Yale's. They're very active here, an important part of our ecosystem, getting companies started and representing those companies from their early days to going public and beyond. We're really grateful to have Dormer here today and to have the support of Shipman & Goodwin as a major leading sponsor for our meeting. So Dormer, thank you for your support. And the title of the panel today is Business Development and Partnership, Is There an Ideal Time? So let's welcome our panel.
Good morning, everyone. As Bill said, I'm Dormer Stephen. I'm the co-chair of the Business and Finance Practice Group at Shipman & Goodwin here in Connecticut. With me today are my panelists, Sarah Naim from NEA, Mary Nakata from Johnson & Johnson Innovation, Briggs Morrison from MPM Capital, Dennis Patrick at Pfizer Ventures, and Christine Brennan from Mrl Ventures Fund. After each of the panelists gives a brief introduction of themselves and their firm, we'll start the discussion. Sarah?
Great. Can you hear me? Okay. So my name is Sarah Naim, and I'm a partner at New Enterprise Associates, which is a large venture capital firm with two main offices, one in the Chevy Chase area right outside of DC, as well as Menlo Park, and we also have an office in New York. We're a 40-year-old firm on our 17th fund, which is a $3.35 billion fund, out of which about 40% is deployed in healthcare. About $800 or $900 million out of that fund will go into the biopharma space. About half our companies are seed or Series A when we first invest, and about half are later stage. And we also put about $200 million to work in each fund in the public markets, 2 to 3 year time horizon. Invest across all different stages, all different therapeutic areas. I've been at the firm for just over 10 years, and prior to that was at Mrl Lynch. I did healthcare investment banking for a couple of years. Prior to that was here at Yale, where I did an MD, MBA, did some banking prior to that, and was bio undergrad at Harvard.
Hi, Mary Nakata with JJDC, Johnson & Johnson's Corporate Venture Group. We invest for things that are on strategy for the businesses in consumer, device, and pharmaceuticals. We have 12 investors who are based globally in San Francisco, Boston, where I am, London, and Shanghai. We deploy about $450 million in capital every year and invest, again, similar to NEA, at all stages, from seed, convertible notes, to Series A and beyond.
Briggs Morrison, executive partner at MPM, established venture capital companies, been around for about 20 years, offices in San Francisco and Boston. Almost entirely focus on starting up new companies in the therapeutics area. About 2/3 of what we invest in right now is oncology.
And I'm Dennis Patrick with Pfizer Ventures. I'm a biochemist by training in oncology research and scientific licensing for 30 years. I joined Ventures a couple years ago. Was very closely linked at the hip with our venture team when I was in the licensing team, so I'm quite familiar with what Elaine and Barbara have been doing for the past decade. Pfizer Ventures is what I call a very strategic investor. Our end goal is to license, acquire, do some kind of a collaboration with our portfolio companies. And if you read the news wires this morning, we just acquired one of our portfolio companies today that we invested in fairly recently, last year. So hopefully we'll be making more investments and more deals with our portfolio companies.
And I'm Christine Brennan. I'm with the Mrl Ventures Fund, which is the corporate venture arm of US Merck. We have about a $250 million fund. We also invest early stage, but preclinically, so seed to kind of IND stage. We put about 15 to 20 million to work over the course of the investment. And we invest strictly in therapeutics, so therapeutics only, but any therapeutic area and any modality. And so even though we're the strategic corporate arm of Merck, we actually invest only in the things that Merck is not doing right now. So if a company was doing the exact same target with the exact same modality, we wouldn't do that. We're not here to invest in those things. We're here to invest in the things that they aren't doing. So cell therapies and gene therapies and all of those kinds of things to give Merck exposure to those different areas. We hope that Merck might acquire something, but there's not necessarily any guarantee that that will happen. We don't take any rights. We're all equity. My background, I've been doing venture now for about 6 years here at Merck, and then prior to that was at Novartis Venture Fund, and before that, about 15 years or so doing business development in either small biotech or big pharma.
So I think one of the questions a lot of scientific founders or early stage companies have are, when should I engage a strategic partner? When is it too early? So if you could share your thoughts on that question. Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure, I can go first. I think a lot of our companies, there are some companies who want to stay stealth for as long as possible because of the targets they're working on, or maybe because their approach is differentiated, but more of a trade secret than something that's patentable. And those companies do tend to hold off even necessarily on putting out press releases or making websites. But a lot of companies in our portfolio and that we work with will start engaging pharma partners very early, in part because they can get a lot of good feedback along the way, understand what the partners are looking for, how they think about developing different targets and sort of long-term development. And also there may be certain reasons why you'd want to talk to pharma early. For instance, in immuno-oncology, a lot of the therapeutics really would need to be combined with a PD-1 or PD-L1. So having those conversations early can keep folks like Merck and BMS engaged and interested and able to move quickly once the company gets close to the clinic. Even if it's just a partnership around being able to provide their PD-1 for free. Otherwise, it's extremely expensive to do those combination studies. So I would say engaging early, but not necessarily inking deals early, because a lot of times it takes a while to figure out how deep is the pond, as we say, how many different targets, say if you're trying to drug a particular enzyme class, how many really good targets are there where you can have good biological validation as well as strong chemical matter, starting matter. So we try to get our companies to have those conversations early, but we encourage them to hold off on licensing out, especially obviously the key programs.
I'd say also, the last panel talked a lot about platforms. There are companies with platforms that are maybe struggling to find an application or targets, and that's where I would say, unless it's like really hugely transformative, a lot of times if you come to us, because our problems are actually of value, we're not necessarily going to be giving you those targets to apply your platform to on a silver platter. So I would say, work really hard to have a product concept before you engage with pharma, because I think you'll have a greater chance of getting traction. But it does take a lot of work to figure out what's the best commercial, scientific, and clinical way to apply a platform.
So many of our companies, when we start them up, we do have strategic investors. Mary and I actually invest in a company together. I think the only thing I would say is too early is if you don't know what you want your company to be. So I think it's really important for the entrepreneur to sort of decide, what is it I'm trying to build before they go talk to a strategic partner. So I think if you're, as pointed out, if you're building an immuno-oncology company, you want to combine with the PD-1, that's great. If you have a platform that you're not really sure, as Mary said, where the technology goes, then you have to ask yourself, am I building a company to capitalize on the application of my technology, in which case I may want partners. If I'm building a company where I really know that I don't want actually partners until I get much further down the road. So my only advice to people is you have to think about what it is you want your company to be before you go talk to people.
And can I go backwards? So I invested last year in 2 oncology companies, very different, same $65 million Series A, which was similar. One is filing an IND, within the next quarter, so they obviously have a molecule, they have data. And then the one that I'm in with Briggs it's a screen. They don't have a development candidate. Well, it'll be a while. So then the question is, why would we plug in that early? Well, it's because of the team. It's because it was Kazumi Shiosaki who founded Epizyme and Mitobridge. She's a serial entrepreneur. She knows how to pick drugs. She knows how to make companies. The scientific founders were luminaries. The team, the chemist that she has is first class. And our feeling is if you give Kazumi $65 million, you're going to get something on the other end. Now, if you're a first-time entrepreneur and you have a screen, we're not going to do that. So that's, I think, is very circumstantial also in terms of when we plug in at what stage.
So I think a biotech company has to be very careful and strategic about when to partner with another company, when to sell rights to their drugs or their technologies. I think if you're a single asset company, I think you have to be very careful about going too early, unless, of course, somebody offers you $825 million for your preclinical asset, and then you sell and run. For a platform, I think there's a lot more flexibility. You can apply that to multiple targets and with multiple partners, and they can fund a lot of that platform development and maturation. And I think that's an ideal time to partner early.
Yeah, it's always hard going last because everybody said everything brilliant. But I think it comes down to the different perspectives. So you have the management perspective, you have the board perspective, and then you have your partner, the potential partner perspective. From the management perspective and from the company, I think people have already spoken to this, you really need to sort of figure out what you want to be when you grow up. And what kind of company do you have now, and what kind of company do you want to have? And that will help direct when and if you need a partner and what kind of partner you need. The partner end, having been in business development for a really long time, wants human proof of concept data in 200 patients and great safety and great efficacy. You can wait till you get to that point and then have that partnership so that the pharma company can help you develop. But a lot of times it's difficult to get all the way there without having some feedback, without having maybe even some non-dilutive capital come into the company earlier. And then there's the board perspective, which always kind of, this is always a deep question for us because we don't necessarily want to give up value unless it makes abundant sense. And we're really going to have a partner that we think is going to help develop the company. So it kind of depends on where you're sitting on this table of three. But you have to really think about it from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think, as to what do you want to be? When does it make sense to get that feedback? I'm not adverse to going out too early as long as you're not disclosing proprietary targets because it can't hurt to get feedback. And then as you progress, it's always nice for the business development person in pharma to see you said you were going to do X, Y, and Z. You did X, Y, and Z. You knew what to do, you did it, and you did it well, and here's the data. And then you build a rapport and a relationship, so then it's easier to kind of engage and potentially move things quickly when you are ready to get the deal done.
So Christine, what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of bringing in a potential strategic partner as an investor in your company, even before a BD deal?
So see, when I said I went last, now I have to go first. So it really, I have not heard a lot of people complain that it's a disadvantage to have a strategic partner in as a venture investor, or as when they do the agreement. It kind of depends on what that agreement is. If we're talking strictly having a strategic that you've partnered with and it's a collaboration, that's usually, again, a good thing as long as the partnership works well. A lot of this depends on how that relationship goes once you partner with somebody. So if your team does not get along with the Merck team, then it's going to be a disaster. But if you get along and everybody can talk, then you can usually really help to speed along the development. From an investment side, I think that at least our view, being the strategic partner, is that we hope we can bring Merck to bear to our companies. We don't have as much capital as NEA. But what else do we have that we can bring to the table? And that for us is Merck expertise. Merck people sit on the SABs of our portfolio companies. Merck reagents. We get, if it makes sense, we can do an MTA. We can use Merck models. We may have a really good anti-PD-1 mouse antibody that tends to help if people are doing IO and trying to do combos and realize the commercially available ones don't work so well. So we hope that we can bring those kinds of things to bear for our portfolio companies so that we can help them get to a position where either Merck or someone else can do a collaboration with the company.
There's
Yeah.
there's
Sorry.
also a statistic real quick that, let's say in the past 5 or 6 years, of the financings they've done in startups, about 25% of them have had corporate venture investors, but of the successful exits, meaning M&A or IPO, and so maybe the window's more like 7 or 8 years, 50% of them have had a corporate investor. So the question is, chicken or the egg, do we pick them right or do we make them good? It's unclear, but there is an advantage, at least the numbers say that.
I mean, I also think having a corporate venture firm involved in the syndicate is helpful for building the syndicate because things we've done, for instance, with Pfizer Ventures, we say, okay, the Pfizer team, a couple of experts in this particular disease area went in, they reviewed the protocol for this phase 2 trial. They gave a lot of good feedback on it. The company has, incorporated that feedback into the protocol. They looked at the manufacturing, and so they give insight into how the program should be run from a big pharma level, and it won't always completely align with what the management is doing because they're obviously trying to be as nimble as possible and maybe keep some costs down in terms of clinical development. But I do think it adds another level of feeling that the diligence has been done well if you have a corporate venture firm in.
Yeah, I was going to echo what Christine said, that when we invest, we're very, very active in our companies. We have people on the SAB, we put people together with our Pharm Sci unit. We try to enable them as much as we possibly can. So in that regard, that's a real asset to the biotech company. I think the one risk is if that corporate VC doesn't follow on in subsequent rounds, that can be viewed very negatively. So that's about the only real downside that, from my perspective, that I can see.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Dennis. I don't see a lot of downside. We see tremendous upside of when the corporate venture people participate. They usually bring the company with them, as you all have described. So that's all very, very positive. The question of what if you have a couple of strategics in and then you go to try to do a deal with somebody who's not in, does that cause issues? We haven't really found that to be much of a problem.
Happened to me.
No.
So we were in Padlock with Mrl Ventures, and BMS bought it. So I mean, we weren't even recused from the room because we were really viewed so much as pure investors that there was no sensitivity. So it does happen. It's not our goal, but to get to the point of these companies are attractive for a host of reasons. So. And we also obviously play nice together. The syndicate that we joined for Ribon Therapeutics, which is a Part 7 company, the Series B was us, Novartis Ventures, AbbVie, and Celgene. So, and they already had Takeda, so there's 5 corporates there.
I will say it's a little different when a firm, a biopharma, particularly a device setting, are investing off of their own balance sheet, so not out of a venture group, but more as a from the corporate level, because we've seen in our device companies a couple times where one of the corporate investor who came in and oftentimes they're pricing the round if they're the only investor at something that's very high, which is great, but it can then constrain the company going forward because they've also sometimes are unwilling to cooperate with taking a down round because then it has implications for their accounting and having to report a loss. So in general, those are really good deals because again, they're usually at very high prices that wouldn't be typical investors, even corporate investors are not going to invest at, but it does end up sometimes constraining the company as well as obviously, I'd say even more in that case than with a CVC if the corporate investing off their own balance sheet doesn't continue to play through, it sends a bad signal and it can have all these other repercussions for the company.
So we touched on platform companies a little bit, and obviously the panel before us talked a lot about single asset versus a platform company. If you're a platform company in your early days and you're considering partnering, one of your programs, what are some of the considerations that you want to think through before you do that?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
So I think, as I mentioned before, we try to think about how deep is the pond and what are there may be within a platform company, they may have, let's say, 10 different targets, depending on if their platform is really, we have the best assays for this particular enzyme class that are going to help us pick the best chemical matter against it. Or maybe it's a delivery platform, so it's kind of broader and can be applied to a lot of different things, or going in and looking for tissue-resident Treg targets or something like that. So how many different targets are there, and what's the biological validation for those versus your chemical starting matter? And also, sometimes some of those targets are just going to be harder because an agonist might be harder to develop than an antagonist, or maybe it's going to be applied to a really broad population. So most of our companies are not doing a whole lot in, say, primary care applications, for instance, or again, maybe you can only really develop it in combo with the PD-1, and so it makes sense to look for a partner earlier. So I think the challenge I see, I recently saw a company, for instance, that had really just started and had already inked a deal on 10 targets with a pharma, and got them to invest at a pretty high valuation, which was great for the seed investors, but not so great for people coming in, because how do we know that there's really 50, there'd be 50 great targets. There could be 3 great targets, and then that pharma may have access to those, and you sometimes don't even know when you first start the whole process. So I think really, once you have a sense of how broad is the platform, and are there things you just would absolutely not do within your company, or you're oncology focused, and maybe there's some autoimmune applications. So at the beginning, really only choosing to partner out those things that wouldn't make sense for you to develop in the company. And then as you go further along, then you can, and you develop your own, say, couple of lead programs, and those move along, then you can maybe think about partnering some of the other ones. But the other constraint always is capital. And so in this more frothy environment, I don't think most companies really need to do as much partnering earlier as they may have had to do, say, 7 years ago. So being cognizant of that, and is it more dilutive to just partner out a couple of high profile or high potential programs versus taking more capital to make the whole company a broader set of assets you're going after.
So I'd say three points of advice. One is you don't want to be a CRO. So if you have a platform, the last thing you want to do is to do one target with this company, another, and et cetera. And you also don't want to necessarily do things in disparate therapeutic areas, because as you, let's say, go to mature, you want capital, you want maybe M&A. You don't want to look like a company that has an IDV, an oncology, and a respiratory product, because the amount of knowledge, biology expertise you need to make all of those happen is just too broad. The other thing, I guess, on the later end is, I would say, and there's not always agreement at the level of the board. Let's say as you're moving, let's say, towards the clinic, it's really a balance of faith and fear. Because if you have
greed and fear.
Greed and fear, right? But the faith part is like the science. If you really say that you look at the animal data, you look at everything, because a lot of it's the science, that's not always about the team, and you say, this is going to be a blockbuster. This is going to be so active, based on mouse data, and that's the faith part. Versus fear, that's fine, but if we take it to phase 2 and we put $60 million in capital and it's negative in phase 2, we're going to end up with this huge loss. That's the fear part, right? So the fear side would say, let's partner early, because we want a pharma partner to do this and fund it. And the faith piece is, if we're going to get, the ones that are the blockbusters in our experience, we've literally seen eye-popping efficacy and dose escalation in phase 1. One of our drugs, we saw efficacy at what we thought was a no-effect dose. Okay, to have partnered that, I'd be like crying like crazy, right? Because you want to take that data, and that's the data that creates these, crazy ass M&As or licenses. Yeah. But if you had partnered that, like at development candidate or IND stage, shame on you. So it's this huge balance, and so that's a part where I don't think there's any good answer. And I know that certain investors, depending on the science, will go one way or the other, and it's a challenge.
Yeah, so just to build on what Marion said, I think Here in New Haven, there's a little company called Arvinas that works on degraders. And I think it was interesting to sort of see their strategy of how to do the partnering. So that, to your point, they sort of said, well, the oncology piece, we can go after some validated targets and test our technology, and probably pretty early on assess both safety and efficacy. So that's something we can probably do. There's other therapeutic areas where it's a much longer road and it's going to take a lot more capital, and maybe those therapeutic areas we think about having partners for those therapeutic areas. As the company evolves, some of those might come in, they say we want to do it ourselves, but I think starting at the beginning it was, well, where can we prosecute the technology in a relatively rapid way that we can sort of do ourselves, and then some of the other applications of the technology might be better with somebody else. There's another company I work on that it's a synthetic lethal pathway company, and so it's all oncology, and so there it's really more a question of, do we have too many targets for us to prosecute ourselves, and would it be helpful to bring in some, a strategic partner who can prosecute some of the other targets and sort of build out the value of the company that way. So I think it depends on how broad your platform is. If it's a multi-TA platform, you might want to think about it that way.
Yeah, another way to look at the decision is, how far can you go with the development of this particular asset with the funding that you have? And if bringing a partner in can make it go much faster and especially the clinical development, much broader, I think that really helps the program and ultimately the company.
Yeah, I would agree. It's always a balance, and it's always a struggle. There is oftentimes no real way to know if you've made the exact right answer until the end of the day comes. I think for people with platforms, there's always this struggle, and there is some value in having a pharma partnership because it kind of validates that platform, and it makes people feel comfortable that there's more reasons to believe. There are other people who also came in and looked at it and had reason to believe that this is going to work. But until you really show that it works, you're going to have a hard time getting that partnership that you want at values that you want for upfronts that you want. So it's a constant struggle.
So how do BD deals impact future rounds, future financings, either who will invest, at what valuations, how do they impact exit transactions or IPOs, if you could talk about that in your experience?
So a pharma partnership that doesn't take equity, right, that just comes in and says, we're going to give you $50 million upfront and biobucks on the back end. From the future round, there's a kind of a pro and a con. The pro is obviously people came in, they looked at it, they believe there's now non-dilutive capital coming into the company, and that program has now kind of been probably at least partially taken off your books. And that's great. But you no longer own that. So if I'm thinking about it from all of my opportunities to exit this company, it's an IPO or an M&A. So either you have enough other programs that I don't have to depend on that partnership to be the pharma company that acquires you, or that's not the money-driving, value-driving program of your company, because when I go to do an IPO, now I don't have that value driver because it belongs to somebody else. So it's, again, another reason why you really have to think about when do you want to partner, which program do you want to partner, why are you partner, what advantages does it give you. Sometimes you're up against the wall and you need the non-dilutive capital, and it's going to just push you over the edge to make sure that you're validated. But other times it can really influence how the next round goes. It's not a bad thing generally, but I don't think you get quite as much credit for it as people hope that they would get for it when it comes to the valuation for the next company. The valuation's really set more on what are the things that are going to drive your exit and going to drive your exit value. And if somebody already owns that one, you've already gotten the money for that, really. And we don't know what we can't really count the rest of it. You may have $1 billion in biobucks, but I don't know that you're ever going to get that. So that really doesn't help to drive that part of the valuation.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I think especially in the cases where you're a single or maybe a two-asset company, it can have a dramatic effect on your valuation and impact subsequent rounds. The one area where it may not be quite so impactful is if it's a regional deal or you've only partnered a small amount of the U.S. market, then you retain quite a bit of value and you'll be fine for your subsequent rounds.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add. I think Christine summarized it very nicely.
I think it also depends on the structure. So the reason I say that is an options, for example,
Sure.
deal can be terminated. And so at any time, if the strategy changes or the competitive landscape, you could have the asset back in your lap that you fully need to fund if that option is not exercised, or et cetera. So I think that's another important thing to consider is, what are the liabilities of those types of structures.
Right, and as long as the option was not taken because of a strategy change and not because they didn't believe in the science, because you will always forever have to explain why so-and-so company didn't take that option, even if it was because they,
Right, 'cause
Pfizer
it
limits
seems like
their
damaged
entire
goods, right.
neuroscience department, and so
Like
they're
they
not
know
going to
too
take the
much.
option on this neuroscience thing. You constantly have to have that like on bullet 2 of your executive summary, right?
And I think, along the lines of structure, if some of our companies have been able to strike deals where they keep co-promote in the U.S., or it's a co-promote to, in the U.S. they would market to all the specialists, and the pharma partner would market to more of the primary care sales, use more of our primary care sales force. So those kind of arrangements are not going to get you as much capital up front, and they can be rather onerous to actually execute in both in terms of the contracts and then when the drug is actually being commercialized. But that type of deal allows you to still have skin in the game, and so you can still have the sense that you have economics and sort of will focus people more on that program than if it's just a complete straight out license. And I think in the public market, most companies are really going to be valued off of their primary, their lead program. It depends on the situation, but particularly preclinical programs, IPO investors are not going to spend a lot of time thinking about, even phase 1 programs are not going to spend a lot of time thinking about. And even if you had a whole bunch of phase 2 programs, it just depends on how much time and energy they have. They're really only going to be able to focus in on, a couple of programs. So some of those programs, if you can, it can improve the story in the sense you have more capital on the balance sheet at the time of IPO. If you out-license one of those programs, and you probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of credit for it anyway. But it always comes at a cost, because one of your programs that you're more focused on could end up failing, and then you're sort of looking to say, well, what else do we have in the pipeline? And if it's just licensed programs, you'll get very little credit for that in the public market.
So Dennis, you touched on regional deals. I think there's certainly a trend in the market where offshore investors are investing in companies in the U.S., and part of the consideration is that they receive territorial rights either for the single asset or some indications of use for a platform. How does that impact either future financings or ultimately an M&A transaction on the back end?
Well, it'll definitely change the valuation, but as long as the biotech has a substantial percentage of the U.S. market, there's still quite a bit of value there. We acquired Medivation, and that was just for U.S. rights, and Astellas has rest of world, but we still obviously paid a lot of money for that drug in the pipeline. So there's still great opportunity. So if you need the non-dilutive funding, a regional deal is not a bad strategy.
Yeah, I guess I didn't say at the beginning of my introduction, I was the chief medical officer at AZ, and was at Pfizer and Merck before that. But we were actually, AZ was a little bit uncomfortable not having complete global rights to the molecule that they bought. They really wanted that, from a corporate point of view, that every business unit everywhere in the world had the same objectives, and they were really driving in the same direction. So understood Pfizer would buy things that they only have the U.S. rights to. I wouldn't say AZ wouldn't, but it was definitely
Not ideal.
It was definitely not ideal. So
Yeah.
I try to encourage people, if you have to do it because you need the money, fine. But really think hard about why you're doing that regional deal, because it could cause a little bit of problems down the road.
Because you end up getting sort of connected at the hip in terms of manufacturing, in terms of adverse event reporting, in terms of what they're doing, in terms of pricing, et cetera. So it's
Definitely adds complexity.
it adds complexity. So you really, to do the second deal, the pharma like Janssen really, really wants that asset, because it's really, it creates a challenge, yeah.
And,
So
and I
my-
wouldn't also underestimate the work it puts on you as the biotech to manage that partnership.
Right, or renegotiate things, et cetera.
It does add a lot of overhead.
Yeah, I mean, we would think of it as it reduces your number of potential partners, or potential acquirers may not, eliminate all of them.
Sure, of course not.
But an Asia rights deal is going to have less impact on potential acquirers than, say, a whole, a European deal, where even fewer people would want to buy something where they don't have European rights. So you have to be pretty thoughtful about those.
Well, I will say again, just from the last comment, that China rights actually are, in some cases, more valuable than European rights. So we just have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about those regional deals.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. It's what region? Are really carefully considering which region makes sense for that partnership. Not a lot, but some of the pharma companies will partner with a Japanese pharma because that's just easier for them. Anyway, even if they own their own thing, and even if they in-house develop their own thing, they may partner with a Japanese pharma because that's something that they've done before, and it's great, and they like that partnership, and then they don't have to worry about Japan or Korea, right? And so if you carved that off versus carving all of Europe off or all of the US off, it's a very different implication to the potential future partners or future acquirer.
But there has been an explosion in folks shopping for China rights.
Absolutely.
And so it's just, it's a very recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes hard to turn those opportunities away because there is such an aggressive, inbound interest in trying to explore that.
And higher upfronts that you wouldn't have seen in the past. We even see some venture firms that are focused, or have Chinese LPs or connections to China, trying to aggregate China rights from a bunch of different companies. And so when they we approach them about some of our companies that are raising capital, often that will come up. So how do they think about China rights? Some of these provisions are showing up in term sheets where they want to have a right of first refusal on, within the syndicate on rights in China, which is different and tricky. But there's so much capital in China right now from real estate, and it's, as people here probably know, more and more challenging for that capital to come to the U.S. And rising Chinese middle class and so forth. So it has become a much bigger issue than it had been in the past, or opportunity, but also dilemma.
I mean, have you seen any of your portfolio companies successfully negotiate a clawback or a buyout of those rights? So if you get to an exit transaction and the buyer wants to control worldwide rights, that you have the ability to claw those back? And if you have seen that, how do you deal with the valuation or the repurchase price?
I've never seen a clawback.
No. I mean, there's the commercially diligent efforts that if they're not doing commercially diligent efforts, you get it back. But usually they define that, well, when I was pharma, we defined that so you could drive a truck through that definition. So it was really hard to say we weren't doing commercially diligent efforts. But that would be the only thing that I've seen that would allow the biotech to really claw it back. But no actual clawback clause that I've seen, at least certainly not recently.
Have you seen any other recent trends in structures or terms of BD deals that you could share?
I haven't seen any unique flavors lately. I mean, there's the options, and then, a lot more on the collaboration side, because I think that there are newer technologies, and the pharma likes to get in there and kind of help to, really direct that and play with those technologies, and still, obviously, because it is a new platform or a new modality, really needing the biotech's help, because they're the experts with that new modality. So in those cases, that's a lot more of a FTE-funded collaboration kind of thing, and maybe for a couple of targets or a disease area or something like that. But those are not atypical. I just think that it depends on what you have as the biotech company.
An interesting observation, because we play in 3 sectors, farm, device, and consumers, and in the device and consumer sectors, there is much more of an ability for us as corporates to make an investment and get rights or a collaboration for pure equity without non-dilutive funding. And it's because there are fewer device investors, and for some of the consumer products, because we are sort of perceived as sort of the exit and channel, we're shaping that. In other words, versus taking other capital, they're willing to do that. So equity will get us way more in those sectors than in a pharma. I wouldn't even ask for rights with just equity, because there's so much capital and so much return on that capital that there's no way that you can compete as an investor and get that. But you can get, you know, if you're trying to develop a device or a consumer product, that might be something that you have to or are interested in doing, approaching corporates to do that kind of double deal. Right?
So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to open questions up for the audience.
Just one question. There's a lot of discussion about Chinese investors in China with the, the made in China policies by the Chinese government and the timing of CFIUS. What are the do's and don'ts for companies Chinese investors or Chinese companies are good or bad? Because it's been very, very restricted now. So, for example, having a Chinese investor invest in a U.S.
question succinctly? I don't think they heard you. It's on now.
Yeah, the question is, there's a lot of discussion about Chinese investors and Chinese companies, and with the tightening of the CFIUS rules, which basically says the U.S. government will review whether or not you can or cannot have a Chinese investor or shareholder, including limiteds, right, of a venture firm. It makes it very complicated to decide when to accept Chinese money or not. So are there any do's and don'ts? Because all of you, I'm sure, are faced with that in the work you do in terms of when to say no and when to say yes.
Well, we asked Dormer.
Yeah, I was going to say, all your lawyers.
So no, it's possible to do them. I think, you know, and it's just a matter of understanding what the probability is of it being a national security problem, et cetera. And it also, a lot of these things which are sort of more China rights, which are options, until the thing is triggered, which is oftentimes like years in the future, it's more a matter of negotiating, like who has to deal with these filings and things like that, than the fact that they have to happen. And a lot of these regional rights things don't necessarily come with investment. It's purely a BD deal. And then you don't have to worry so much about CFIUS as it relates to investing. Now, for investing, that's a whole different story, and it's still a gray zone. But I think people, the Chinese investors themselves, are being conservative in some instances, or careful, as are we. But it's not necessarily completely stopping the flow of Chinese investors into the companies. It's just making it much more thoughtful. And in some instances, yeah, maybe slowing it down, but it. You know, and so I think there is an impact, but it's not like it's gone to zero for sure.
I mean, it's certainly a fluid situation as it relates to the biotechnology world. Right now, it really comes down to whether you're in the select group of toxins and agents. But the definition of critical technologies is under review, and I think most practitioners believe it'll be expanded. We're hopeful that it won't be expanded greatly, so it doesn't catch a large number of deals in the net. But CFIUS, if you get caught in the net, it doesn't matter if it's a 0.5% investment. It doesn't matter if it's a $100,000 investment. There's no materiality that goes in, that goes into the equation. It's really, is this critical technology in the biotech world? Taking money from an offshore investor. There is a separate side of the house, which is export and licensing. And so if you are doing, rights to an embargoed country like China, then there is a separate analysis for that as well. I think where it really gets tricky on the investment side, for example, is if you have a tranche financing. And right now, you have a company that is not, handling critical technology, but between now and the second or third tranche, it is defined in a way that captures this company. What happens, and how does the syndicate, deal with that hole that could be in the syndicate? And then on the licensing side for an option deal, again, up front, you're not exercising the license, you're just receiving an option. But down the road, the company is defined to be dealing with critical technology. How do you deal with that? And it requires a process to go through a review process and perhaps even a consent by the government. So it's an interesting time. I think we're all hopeful that it will be resolved in a way that doesn't have a chilling effect on, capital coming in and deals, offshore licensing deals going forward. Other questions?
On the subject of regional BD deals, in particular selecting a partner, their view on the market is a big component in terms of finding a deal to be had. Briggs, you were referring to China being viewed in terms of a market potential as potentially greater in circumstances against, say, Europe. I agree with you. What are some of those components that go into that consideration from your perspective when markets generally are not that mature there still in terms of where they are now to where they might be?
Yeah, so I think both Pfizer and AZ have really big components of their commercial organization, their commercial revenue from China. So I think they know those markets actually pretty well, and I think can quite realistically add that into their value equation when they're looking to license things in. Probably Merck as well. I don't know, but I think so. I think some of the large companies have pretty good boots on the ground and deeply understand the Chinese market.
I mean, it can also be a prevalence question. There are certain diseases that are more prevalent in
Sure.
Asian populations, and pricing in particular sectors or if therapeutic areas may be closer or further from say U.S. pricing in Europe as well as in Asia.
My name is Matt Walden with a company called FitScript. We make a digital therapeutic. Oh, sorry. My name is Matt Walden. I'm with a company called FitScript. We're located here in New Haven. We make a digital therapeutic for diabetes. You haven't mentioned digital therapeutics, and I'm wondering how that fits for you in terms of your future portfolios.
Yeah, I can. We don't as the Mrl Ventures Fund, but we have an entire separate fund called the Global Health Innovation Fund that's actually been around a lot longer than us, that used to do devices, and digital has now completely moved to digital. Their view is much more around being really strategic to Merck and looking at digital things that are actually can impact Merck's current work, whether that's getting scripts, whether that's a diabetes to help whatever the drug that they have to really help patients through a digital, whether a clinical trial, digital patient selection, those kinds of things are really their focus right now. So it's a very big, very active group with, I think it's almost 600 million at this point now because they're an evergreen fund that are focused completely on that and personalized medicine, but not us.
I mean, Johnson & Johnson is exploring digital therapeutics. I think we are very focused in certain therapeutic areas within pharm, and so it really depends on the business model in terms of FDA approval, reimbursement versus direct to consumer. But it is definitely something that we are open and are exploring.
Yeah. I mean, I think in some firms, more traditional venture firms, that we have a consumer group at NEA. 60% of what we do is tech, but digital health can sometimes get stuck between different. So it's not the bread and butter of what we do in the therapeutics group, but we have somebody who focuses on services, but also does digital health and HIT. But he's got a lot of really interesting services deals. He can put $50-100 million of capital to work in, and I think it's an area where I think a lot of firms maybe don't have as much focus right now, but hopefully in coming years we'll have more.
I think the reality of the challenge is, I mean, there's single drugs that make $6 billion a year, and digital therapeutics are sort of competing for the time and the development costs to be able to bring that digital therapeutic to market. And the question is, will it be able to compete from a revenue perspective with all of these other immuno-onc drugs, et cetera, in terms of the unmet need that are really like extending lives for decades, or we're looking for cures in certain serious diseases. So the question is, how does that fit? And that's And that's I think the struggle of why it's a little bit consumer, because some of these things are more wraparound for other products. So, but anyway, but not to say that, but I think that there's tremendous promise and value, and for us, for big pharma like us that really are the ones that are channels for delivering some of these healthcare solutions, you're almost going to need a partner like that to be able to really expand the market for those therapeutics. So.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Thank you to the panelists.